Now, I didn't read the book, so I don't know, maybe this is a very wrong question to ask, but I'm somewhat confused about what morality or ethics means for Patočka. Because I noticed during your talk you spoke about authentic existence and moral existence as if they are the same? Or like, does he reduce authentic human existence to ethical existence? Like, what is the relationship?
Yeah, well, I think that he makes some very radical claims about the importance of the Socratic question. And the Socratic question for Patočka is fundamentally moral. I mean, he uses in the book, he uses morality and ethics interchangeably, there's no distinction there. But he sees all of the Socratic question as being fundamentally a moral question, but for him the entire history of Western metaphysics is basically built upon an answer to the Socratic question which privileged objective truth above what was merely relative. So he actually says that the entirety of Western metaphysics is based on anthropological foundations. And these anthropological humanist foundations are moral. So for him, authentic existence is fundamentally moral. I mean, he even makes a criticism of Husserl, where he says that the domain which is opened by the transcendental reduction is non-problematic precisely because it silences certain questions, and specifically the question, what is the good? So that these moral questions are bracketed, and there's a focus on truth, but it's actually a misguided attempt to answer what was originally a moral question. So for him, authentic existence is irreparably moral and based on that.
Yeah, so I'm also not really at ease in this field, so feel free to state bluntly that it was a better question and finish. But when you say, if I understood correctly, that the essence is always rejectable, so to speak. So what I wonder is if we're talking about a moral essence, is the rejecting of the essence immoral or moral? Because it's taken up in a movement of morality. So is rejecting the moral essence something immoral? Or could we see it as taken up in a movement of morality? And if the latter, how to see the difference between immorality and a moral movement?
The question raises a really, really important point that I've been thinking about in Patočka. Where is immorality in the whole conception? It doesn't exist, I think. There's authenticity and inauthenticity. I think that what Patočka sees as a problem with a lot of conceptions of moral philosophy is that they say, okay, this is moral, this is immoral, and it makes it rigid, but Patočka sees morality rather as this form of existence, as the fundamental form of existence. And I don't think that there is immoral actions. There can be actions which are inauthentic. Now he outlines this idea of authentic existence, which I talked about, but that also implies inauthentic existence. So something inauthentic for him would just be to blindly accept given standards and act according to them. So even if you're acting morally in relation to this standard, you're acting inauthentically, and therefore you've abdicated the moral task which is imposed upon each person. But what I do think he allows for, because he specifically wants to avoid a situation where we no longer have any criteria from which to look at actions and judge them. And what he does with this idea of authentic existence is to give a structure of existence which we can look at and say, does this correspond to that? And if not, then it's in us. So for example, if you extend it to a political level and you look at a totalitarian regime, because it tries to silence and stop any kind of debate about these questions, it is inauthentic, which is, I think, about as close to immoral as the other. Maybe people would disagree with me, but at least from my reading of it, I didn't think that there was.
I think I would disagree.
Oh yeah, okay.
Do you want to speak to this, or is this question?
No, I had a totally.
Maybe. I mean, I think it is complicated, but maybe the complication can be described as a complication, because I think it's a it's a great question, by looking at two comparable figures that are clearly influential for Patočka, Kierkegaard on one side and Heidegger on the other, because there's a kind of combination of that vocabulary. There seems to be, though I agree with you, it's not exactly stable linguistically, and of course we're dealing with a French translation, so we'd have to look at the Czech original Czech, but there seems to be something like a distinction that you find in Kierkegaard and Heidegger, though they're understood differently, between something called morality and something called, in Kierkegaard, religion or religious. And then in Heidegger, morality and authenticity and authenticity. And the difference is, I think, and I think this is what you presented quite well, the difference is something like this, that, so I'll speak Kierkegaardian, that ethics is always about universality of norms. And then ethical action is the subsumption of individuality to the universality of norms. First in its Kantian sense, as individual, and then it culminates in Hegel, where I am completely part of the moral community, so Hegelian Sittlichkeit, for which then you need a state apparatus. That's ethics, i.e. Platonism, morality. And then something like this deeper sense of authentic existence is, again, now I'll speak Kierkegaardian, spiritual life or religious, you know, the night of faith. And this goes back a bit to this fascinating quote that Francesco mentioned, where he says, spiritual existence, I'm not happy with that term. So you can see that, I mean, you can read that in a very Kierkegaardian way, that that the authentic existence is not an ethical existence. So in that sense, it's unethical. In fact, it is the suspension of the ethical. Very much in a Kierkegaardian sense, because it is dissidence, it is protest. And then it's this new form of existence, which on the other hand, I think, at least based on that, which is the first time I heard that quote, it's also not religious. It's not spiritual exact, but it's something else. And then the difficulty is, what's the new vocabulary we need? And then in Heidegger, then it's precisely this idea that it's authenticity, but it's not authenticity towards death, etc., but it's authenticity towards the movement of the good.
Yep.
And so then that's the break with Heidegger, that the good really is beyond being. So the fundamental question is not the meaning of being. The fundamental question is the good. So,
Yeah.
But I think, so there is a kind of immorality. I would agree that there is a kind of immorality in this sense to authentic existence. In this, let's call it Kierkegaardian sense, this is a place to begin with to understand it.
Absolutely, I would 100% agree with that, authentic existence is precisely the breaking of morality as traditionally understood. But yeah, I would think that in what he's trying to get at, you couldn't particularly say this is moral or immoral, because what is authentic is essentially breaking with that rigid structure within which you could define morality.
But you could, I mean, it's a complicated one. If Patočka does think that all moral systems are historical, then take the example you gave of the dissidents is precisely that you know, the fascinating dynamic of the dissidents that came around Patočka was they were ex-communists who were the torturers and the writers who were tortured by their torturers. So it's the fallout of a kind of dissolution of the system from both sides who come together. That's the solidarity of the shaken. And in World War I, that's Daniel Leufer, the French, and Junger, the German. So there is a kind of, everyone is immoral because I'm the ex-Stalinist. So I'm immoral because I now challenge Stalinism, so I'm thrown out of the party. And you're the writer, you're the immoral person. Even though I had tortured you, by reference to this trauma, which is the dissolution of the system, we are bonded in a way. And so in a sense, the structure of dissidence is a structure of immorality on every side. So everyone is unholy, to go back to the language, everyone is contaminated. And this contamination is now the point of an impurity, namely a new solidarity.
Yeah, and I think in relation to that, I think the points that Francesco raised about the Patočka being kind of unhappy with the spiritual man and the sort of thing, and wanting something more political. I thought, and it's an opinion which maybe you would disagree with, but there's a point in this at which he quotes Masaryk quoting Dostoevsky, saying that the idea of the eternal soul is the one truly great idea. And I think for Patočka, obviously is in other works, and here also he talks about this care for the soul, but I think what he sees as so valuable in Christianity is precisely the conception of the soul that is instituted, that everybody has this soul, and that there is a constant relationship not just to the self but to another, a personalized other who you're in dialogue with about your soul. There's a sense of judgment, and I think that that's very attractive to Patočka because it institutes this constant measuring of what's being done against an absolute. But obviously in Czechoslovakia at the time and in the political situation, you had all of these different perspectives who needed to come together. And I was wondering, and it's something I'd like to look into more, if in a political community, in the solidarity of the shaken, that interpersonal realm could take the place of that one transcendent, personalized deity to whom you have responsibility. And that perhaps for Patočka himself, he does seem to like this terminology of the soul and things, but that he saw perhaps in a community of criticism but also of positing and discussion of the good, that it could in some sense replace that notion which had been lost for a lot of people.
Yeah, well, that's maybe the biggest problem of dissidence. So what happens when this totally negative opposing force has to become positive?
Yep.
So this happened sometimes in history. But what happens when all these different forces gather together in dissidence, have to find a positive common element in order to build a new politics beyond the crisis? Yeah, that's a good question. That's why many dissident movements actually lost. They couldn't find this positive element. Maybe it's impossible to find a positive element. With regards in particular to this text that you used today, I think it is useful to recollect the context in which it originated. The reference you made to Radl, I think is fundamental. So the link between Patočka and this other great Czech philosopher and politics, Emanuel Radl, was one of the first in Czechoslovakia in the 30s to introduce anti-positivist philosophy. So that's why all the young generation of Patočka was so attracted to him. Because actually he represented for the first time a kind of philosophy which is absolutely against anti-positivism and also against any idea of normative ethics. That's the point. I don't think that this kind of ethics is anti-ethics or something. I think that it's possible to conceive morality or an ethics which is different from a series of norms, actually. So in this sense, he's trying, following the thought of Radl to another kind of more active and based not on norms but on actions in this case. And it's not the case that actually what Patočka underlined as the most important point in Radl's philosophy is this idea of aktivní filozofie, of active philosophy. In an interview Patočka gave in 1967, recollecting his young philosophical formation, he said that for him and for his generation, the idea of an active philosophy was totally against this positive, closed idea of philosophy and also of ethics was fundamental. So yeah, I think this link should be absolutely emphasized. And about the idea of, I totally agree with the idea of this intertwined permeability that characterize the idea of conflict in this case. I'm not sure actually that we can deal with dissidence as something in which this idea of ex-Stalinist who was the violent one become the opposite. So I think we should be very, very careful in this case, because the most part of dissidents, especially in Czechoslovakia, was represented also by a communist part, but mostly by a humanist communism. So there was a large part of intellectuals and politics in Czechoslovakia who were communists, and also being dissidents, they were still communists, but that have never been Stalinist actually. So this is also maybe more complex. So from the beginning they tried as well to conceive a communist thought that was against this idea of strict and closed envision of politics and history. And not casually, Patočka represented the fundamental figure for this young generation of communists. Karel Kosík, Ivan Sviták, and Bohumír Sokol were all very close to Patočka, even if he was not a communist. That's another interesting point. The importance Patočka had for the young, dissident generation of communists in Eastern Europe. That's all right.
Very, just a quick comment, nothing to do with the conversation. I mean, you mentioned there are other philosophers that you didn't mention, so I just thought I would make a suggestion for how you might further develop this idea of the historical essence. In Patočka has an interesting relationship with Merleau-Ponty, and it's not clear. I think Patočka probably didn't. I don't think he ever refers to the visible and the invisible. Actually, so I think most likely he hadn't read it. But in Visible and the Invisible, and also in the Nature lecture, he tries to develop this idea, the sensible idea, or the verbal lesson. He does this in relation to Heidegger, but strangely, most often comes up also in a naturalistic context, in discussions of nature that he's trying to. It strikes me that, and of course, on the back of Merleau-Ponty's mind, always, or at the front of his concerns, always is a confrontation with stuff. So just struck me that that's one possible way of developing this idea.
Okay.
I don't know how to put it. I just wanted to say something in Kant's favor. I mean, Kant also was mentioned but not discussed.
Yeah.
But I mean, I get very nervous when Kant is sort of swept aside and what to say. And I mean, I was just thinking, even taking the title you mentioned, Kierkegaard, fear and trembling is a categorical imperative. Each of you work out your salvation, each of you, with fear and trembling. And it seems to me that Kant, just accomplished something absolutely so tremendous, which in Patočka is the question of the good. Each of you, that which is law for one is that which each should be doing. This is the question of the good. And so even if this is his only, he says, I want an ethic of commandment without already given laws, but it seems to me that that's precisely what the Kant, in a sense, only decides, he decides on no law. There is no pre-given law. There is a form of law. And I don't know, I just wanted to say that this question of authenticity, immorality, the whole discourse just makes me quite nervous. And this talk of infinite flexibility. I mean, in a court of law, if a judge said that he was now going to engage in some infinite flexibility with, due process or something, this is not something anyone wants.
But that's precisely it. That they're to be separated, and I think his problem is that they've been identified. That law is totally separate, and of course this is not law. And I think the problem is that the ideals of what morality should be have been identified with what law should be. So he would think that, I think Patočka wouldn't want this infinite flexibility within a legal system.
But then the whole Socratic process at the same time is, theoretical lawgiving is to found the laws of the future in the process of reflection upon the good. It's not at all, you begin in the Apology with saying positive law as it stands is not the good. This is the Atlantic phase, right? Yeah. So you begin, the entire philosophical process begins by distancing the good from positive law, but at the same time, the protreptic is precisely using the question of the good in order to close the gap between positive law and the good. So it seems like if the whole goal of this conception of ethics is simply to distance authenticity, whatever you want to call it, from law, then that seems neither Socratic nor
Well, I think two things. I think one fundamental thing is that, anyway, it is difficult to sell in one way what he says, but that it's about the movement that yes, something does need to be positive, but only to be rejected again. But there can never be any definitive positive, even after a process, no matter how critical, due to different things.
Isn't that Kant?
Well, I think the other problem,
Critique?
the other problem
Autonomy?
with Kant,
I mean, you know?
and he brings it up when he talks about Scheler, is that universality is precisely not the characteristic of morality that he wants. Like in Scheler's conception.
But is the question of the good to be universal? Or is that just a parochial check?
no.
Well, no, but that's
So if you go to Shaler, the good is never formal, and so it's always non-formal. And so
So the question of the good.
yeah, the question. What are you saying? Sorry. Question of the good is a
For
formal
Patočka,
question.
is the question of the good, is this need for elentic, is that a universal injunction? Or is this just a Czech concern in the 1970s?
it's a possibility of existence which was opened up, but I think that Patočka constantly recognizes the fact that there is always the possibility of inauthentic existence. So what the question of the good opens is a possibility for authenticity. And I think I didn't talk about Scheler at all, but he says a lot of really interesting things in relation to Scheler. But I think probably one thing that he takes from Scheler is this total rejection of universality as a criteria of a moral law. Like if anything is universal, it needs to be particularly relevant. So I think he goes a lot more along that route.
I think you touch on two absolutely central points. Your way to think about Kant is actually what Hermann Cohen says. So in Hermann Cohen's Kant's Begründung der Ethik, he says, the greatness of Kant is to have recuperated the transcendence of the good from being through the categorical imperative. And Cohen uses that language to speak about Kant. So in that sense, you're absolutely right that is a way to read Kant, and that is the way that Kant was read. That then becomes very important for a certain tradition of ethical thinking, culminating in Levinas, because Cohen is actually central for Levinas in this respect. And in Levinas, it is a commandment, precisely in the way that it's a categorical imperative. I think the difference, and that's why it's a deep question, is that again, as you correctly said, in Kant, it's not any particular law; it's the form of law. But ultimately, it's reason. It's an idea of reason. And then there's a complicated question in Kant about, well, what is first, freedom or the law of reason? And then there's different reasons. But ultimately, for people like Patočka, even for Levinas, it's about reason and autonomy.
Sure.
And it's also tied to a certain conception of the moral self as a completely active project. So maybe part of the disagreement, that's why I think it's kind of a deep question, the disagreement is different strategies to think of the good at the end of metaphysics, beginning with Kant. And then you have different options, different philosophical options. And in Kierkegaard, again, Kierkegaard understands Kant, but what he objects is that it's reason.
And I guess, I'm sorry, I probably muddied the waters, but I guess what I was reacting to is, in a sense, I think that in order for Patočka even to be talking about ethics, he's actually in the Kantian vein. I mean, even if this question of the good, for it to be a foundation for anything we would refer to as ethics, for it to have any binding power, the very need, he's trying to perpetuate the need, perpetuate and disseminate the need for the question of the good to be asked. And all I was basically saying is, this is a kind of categorical imperative.
Right, but that's why there's the second, but I think that the difference is this, and this is the second point that's very important.
It's a form of lawfulness, I guess.
But it's not a form of lawfulness, because in Kant, a form of lawfulness implies that irrespective of any circumstances, I can always act in a way that conforms with the categorical imperative. So the capacity to raise the question of what is right, so not what is good, but what is right, is a capacity that I have all the time and can be exercised regardless of the historical circumstances. That's the radicality of Kant. And it also means that it can be exercised regardless of where I come from in society. Patočka is actually much more Heideggerian. And one of the things that he talks about in Historicité, where he says that the question of the good is what he calls in French at least an effective tonality. And I don't know what the Czech term is. So it's this Heideggerian idea that, I'll put it in Heidegger talk, the question of being is not a question that all human beings at any point just simply ask. It's only under very special historical circumstances and special kind of people, so used, right, because it's not everybody, who somehow are able to be seized by the question, and thus, in being seized by the question, come to articulate that question. So that's the radical anti-Kantianism that...
Although Kant would also say, Kant, at the same time, he would say ethical action in accordance with the form of lawfulness is available for everyone, everywhere, but I think he also recognized that even the crystallization of an idea of law is something that only occurred under certain circumstances at a very late period of time.
Right, but that first part, that's the radicality of Patočka. Patočka denies that first part, what you said. I.e., philosophy, or let's put it, the capacity to act morally in a genuine sense, which is the care of the soul, which is Europe and philosophy, is not, in principle, possible across all history. And the paradox is that it only happened under specific circumstances, which is European history. And that's going to be important in the heretical essays, that the argument for Europe begins with the Near Eastern civilizations, to show that Near Eastern civilizations were defined by the transcendental impossibility of philosophy. The Kantian argument would be Near Eastern civilizations transcendentally were constituted where there could have been something like the discovery of the moral law. But then, precisely you said, for purely empirical reasons, that wasn't the case. That's the radicality of Patočka, is to say, no, that's the uniqueness. So in a sense, the uniqueness of Europe is transcendental. No, that's not the right vocabulary for it, but it's a clear vocabulary. And that's where I think it's not, it's actually, it's complicated.
But the care of the soul is not, so the care of the soul is not to be universalized.
That's right.
In post-European terms.
Well, let's put it this way.
It's a parochial sort of occupation.
Provincial. Yeah. Yeah.
It's European.
Well, it goes back to what yours was saying. It's tied to locality. This is the complication of the provincialism of Europe is inscribed in the very idea of Europe, and that's what I think in Francisco's. That's the critique of Patočka, that the history of Europe has actually been the attempt to universalize the particular, which is the dream of the Holy Roman Empire, and which is the European Union. The argument of Patočka is Europe is provincial, but that provinciality has no place. So that's the discussion we had with yours, that Socrates cannot philosophize outside of Athens, is rooted to the place, so it's provincial. And yet Socrates is himself the person who has no place, in the place in which he could only philosophize. The atopos of Socrates, in the topos of Athens. And in that sense, that is not cosmopolitan, in the Kantian sense.
And yet here we sit discussing Socrates and the question of the good. There's an extraordinarily universal impetus in what Socrates, the atopos, did and what he asked. And so I don't know, again, I'm sorry, very vague,
No,
very muddy.
Do you want to say something more? Or no? Yeah.
No.
Carl.
It wasn't really that much to what we were talking about, but I felt there was sort of a big tension in the text, and it can be described in the form of a question. to what extent is Patočka himself a metaphysician, or what is the true status of Patočka's stance? Because in some sense, I would tend to think after reading his critique of Bravo, and when he says Bravo is too Platonic, there's too much metaphysics coming into play, and then it also plays with this question whether there really is something like Socratic Platonism or Platonic certaintism. And then, so from this, I would think he really tries to go against metaphysics, but in some sense, when he talks about what you were mentioning, the two tendencies of the moral, so the scientific one on one side, and sort of the romantic protest against pedantry on the other side, he specifically says that with the second one, so the romantic protest against pedantry, the problem with it is that it lacks the philosophical vocalization grounded upon general metaphysics. So clearly there is some need for some kind of metaphysics.
Yep.
And so my question is the concept of the historical essence, is it a metaphysical concept, or are we even entering metaphysics already?
Well, one thing that he says in the book is that one huge mistake has been to think that because a specific type of metaphysics has been delegitimized in the 20th century, that is metaphysics as a whole which has been delegitimized. So he wants to, and you are right, there is a definite metaphysical element to what he's doing. It depends on how you define what he means by metaphysics. In the beginning of the book, when he's talking about Czech humanism, he splits them into two types, a metaphysical and a non-metaphysical. And the distinction there is basically, and if you take that as his distinction, his definition of metaphysics, that the metaphysical side, be that Christian or whatever, posits something, an ultimate meaning to things. It posits something transcendent, and in some sense, the world as it is in relation to something beyond it. Whereas the other conception totally rejects any form of transcendence or any relationship of dependence between the two realms. So he definitely, if it's defined in that sense, then he definitely wants to, it's an essential moment of authentic existence to posit something beyond them. He says that, man essentially, in an authentic existence, rejects what is given as such in favor of a movement towards true being, which is always, the good, he quotes, the good is beyond being. And in that sense, that's what creates this dialectic, is a form of metaphysical thinking.
So in that sense, can we say ethics are prior to metaphysics? Because ultimately the movement is ethical, right?
The ethics has an essentially metaphysical component to it. And then metaphysics is essentially ethical.
So, perhaps on that note, we can take a short break, but first thank Daniel for